Here in the South, we know to avoid mounds like these. Fire ants can not only be a real pain, they can kill small animals and some people when bites trigger severe reactions.
Fire ants have spread across Texas for decades, taking over fields, pastures, and wild land. But now, something strange is happening in protected areas where their numbers are suddenly dropping. Scientists studying fire ant behavior noticed a hidden pattern deep in the data. In the same places where fire ants are disappearing, a long-lost native animal is quietly returning after many years. This unexpected return may be changing the balance of nature in ways no one predicted. Could this small creature really be behind the fall of one of Texas's most aggressive insects? Or is something else happening in the land? Join us to find out. The creature wiping out fire ants. Late one Tuesday morning in September, a wildlife biologist sat quietly inside her truck on the Edwards Plateau near Kerrville, Texas. She had just finished reviewing fire ant survey data and could not stop staring at the numbers. For a long time, she did not even start the engine. She had monitored the same grid for 9 years. During that time, she learned every pattern the landscape could produce. She knew where fire ant mounds usually appeared, how colonies spread across the pastures, and what the density numbers normally looked like from season to season. The data had always been predictable, but what she was seeing now was different. 3 specific pasture zones were showing a trend she had never recorded before. Fire ant colony density was declining. The drop was not sudden or dramatic. It was steady, measurable, and happening across multiple survey seasons. The more she studied the numbers, the more unusual they seemed. There was no obvious explanation. Nothing in the monitoring records suggested chemical treatments or other human actions that could have caused such a consistent decline. Yet the pattern continued to appear across all 3 zones. Something was changing. As she reviewed the locations more closely, another detail stood out. The affected pasture corridors shared one important feature. They were the same areas where another animal had quietly started returning to the landscape. For the first time in 40 years, that animal was making a comeback. The connection immediately caught her attention. Before leaving the site, she called the research station. When someone answered, she shared a simple observation that summed up everything she was thinking. Something out there is eating them. The statement was based on more than a feeling. The survey data clearly showed that fire ant colonies were shrinking in places where no chemical intervention had been recorded. The decline was happening year after year, following the same pattern. Researchers began looking more closely at the possibility that a returning native species was influencing the fire ant population. For many Texans, this animal was once a familiar sight. People had seen it in backyards, ranches, and open fields. Then, over time, it disappeared. As decades passed, many assumed it was gone for good. But nature often works quietly. While most people never noticed, this forgotten animal slowly began reclaiming parts of its former range. At the same time, fire ant numbers started falling in those same areas. The evidence was still being studied, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. But what did these fire ants do to Texas? Let's find out. Fire ants. To understand why the survey data from those 3 pasture zones was so surprising, it is important to understand what red, imported fire ants did to Texas. Not the simple version that people casually mention, but the much larger story that unfolded across millions of acres of land and changed the natural balance of the state in ways many Texans witnessed without fully realizing it. Red, imported fire ants first arrived in the United States through the port of Mobile, Alabama, during the 1930s. By the 1950s, they had reached Texas. Once they arrived, they spread rapidly across grasslands, ranches, and open countryside. Native ecosystems were completely unprepared for their arrival. The ants came from South America. In their native environment, many natural enemies helped keep their numbers under control. Parasites, diseases, predators, and competing species had spent millions of years evolving alongside them. Together, these forces prevented fire ant populations from growing unchecked. Texas offered a very different situation. The ants found warm soil, open landscapes, and an endless supply of food. Most importantly, they faced almost no natural resistance. With nothing to slow them down, their populations expanded quickly across the state. A single colony can contain between 100,000 and 500,000 worker ants. In heavily invaded pasture areas, colony densities can reach between 100 and 200 mounds per acre. Their nests appear almost everywhere. They thrive near ponds, lakes, rivers, streams, reservoirs, and irrigation channels. They also establish colonies in wetlands, forests, grasslands, shrublands, agricultural fields, coastal areas, and urban spaces. They are just as comfortable in parks and playgrounds as they are in ranch country. Lawns, schoolyards, golf courses, gardens, and picnic grounds often become home to large colonies. During colder months, colonies may move beneath pavements or closer to buildings, while newly mated queens spread into fresh pasture land. Each mound functions like a single living system. Thousands of ants work together with one goal: finding food and gathering protein. In Texas pastures, the protein source they target most effectively is one that plays a critical role in another animal's survival. That animal is the Texas horned lizard. For countless generations, horned lizards depended almost entirely on native harvester ants. These large seed harvesting ants were once common across the rocky limestone soils of the Edwards Plateau. Their colonies covered the landscape, providing a dependable food source for the lizards. A single adult horned lizard needs between 60 and 100 harvester ants every day to survive. These ants are ideal prey. They move slowly, making them easy to catch. They are large enough to provide valuable nutrition. They also travel along predictable trails, allowing horned lizards to locate feeding areas and return to them again and again. Over millions of years, the horned lizard evolved around this dependable food source. Harvester ants were so abundant and reliable that the lizard never needed to develop another feeding strategy. Then the fire ants arrived. Unlike many species that share the same environment, red imported fire ants do not simply live alongside harvester ants. They replace them. Fire ant workers locate harvester ant colonies and attack them in overwhelming numbers. Using their massive populations, they take control of territory, destroy colonies, kill queens, and establish their own dominance. Areas once occupied by harvester ants can be converted into fire ant territory within a single season. As fire ants spread across the Edwards Plateau, harvester ant populations began to collapse. Colony after colony disappeared from invaded areas. The decline became so severe that many locations could no longer support horned lizard feeding needs. The lizards could not easily adjust. Their entire biology had been shaped around a food source that was suddenly vanishing. Without enough harvester ants, reproduction declined. Populations began shrinking. One pasture after another lost its horned lizards. One corridor after another became empty. The decline happened slowly but steadily over several decades. Many Texans remember a time when horned lizards were common sights in yards, fields, and pastures. Children growing up during the 1950s and 1960s often encountered them regularly. They were familiar and easy to find. As the years passed, those sightings became increasingly rare. Eventually, entire generations grew up without seeing a horned lizard in the wild. What had once been a normal part of everyday life slowly faded from the landscape. The newest discovery of horned lizards. For 7 years, Dr. Sarah Kessler had been studying Texas horned lizards across several protected sites on the Edwards Plateau. Her work focused on helping the species recover after decades of decline. Every season, she carefully monitored the land and recorded changes in both lizard and ant populations. She understood that restoring these animals would take patience and many years of effort. Nothing about the process was expected to happen quickly. The recovery program focused on one important goal before anything else. Researchers needed to bring back healthy populations of harvester ants. These native ants are the main food source for Texas horned lizards. Without enough harvester ants, the lizards cannot survive or reproduce successfully. Because of this, restoring ant populations became the foundation of the entire project. The challenge was that fire ants had already spread through many areas. In places where fire ants were abundant, harvester ants struggled to recover. Researchers had to reduce fire ant numbers over several seasons before native ants could begin returning. Even then, progress was usually slow and difficult. Every small improvement required years of work and careful monitoring. Most of Dr. Kessler's sites followed a similar pattern. Harvester ant numbers slowly increased in treated areas. Horned lizard populations became more stable, though they remained small. The results were encouraging and showed that the program was working. Still, nobody expected dramatic changes from one season to the next. Then something unusual appeared in the data. 3 pasture zones on the western edge of the monitoring network began showing a completely different pattern. Fire ant colony numbers were falling faster than expected. The decline was clear and easy to measure, yet there was no obvious reason for it. Dr. Kessler immediately reviewed the program records. She checked treatment logs to see whether any fire ant bait had been used in those areas. Then she checked the records again. Finally, she reviewed everything a third time to make sure nothing had been missed. The answer remained the same every time. No chemical treatment had been applied there. No bait had been deployed in those pasture zones. According to every record available, the program had done nothing that should have caused such a decline. Yet the fire ant populations continued to decrease. The mystery only became more interesting. Wanting answers, Dr. Kessler visited the first pasture herself. She spent 2 days carefully examining the landscape. She moved from mound to mound, studying signs of activity and searching for clues. Every observation seemed to raise even more questions. Then she noticed something remarkable. Texas horned lizards were living in the area. These were not animals released by the recovery program. They were not part of any planned reintroduction effort. They appeared to be a naturally established population. The lizards were feeding, reproducing, and surviving on their own. They moved freely across the pasture and showed signs of long-term residence. This discovery surprised everyone involved in the project. Researchers had spent years trying to rebuild populations elsewhere, yet here was a group already thriving without direct assistance. Another detail soon attracted attention. The pasture sat beside a protected limestone outcrop corridor. This area had been managed for 11 years under special conservation rules. Predators were excluded and livestock access was restricted. Interestingly, those measures had never been designed to address fire ants. Even so, the protected corridor may have created conditions that benefited wildlife in unexpected ways. Over time, the area remained relatively undisturbed compared to surrounding land. That stability may have helped horned lizards persist while they disappeared elsewhere. Researchers could not ignore the connection. The discovery opened the door to many new possibilities. So why were the horned lizards hunting what once pushed them off their territory? Stick around. The battle against fire ants. When Dr. Sarah Kessler compared the horned lizard records with the fire ant survey results, a remarkable pattern appeared. She mapped both sets of data across the same pasture grid and carefully studied the results. What she found was impossible to ignore. The areas with the highest numbers of horned lizards were also the areas showing the greatest decline in fire ant colonies. The overlap was exact and far too strong to be a coincidence. The connection became even more interesting as researchers looked deeper. The lizards and the declining fire ant populations occupied the very same sections of land. It was not a rough match or a general trend. The two patterns lined up almost perfectly. Every new review of the data pointed to the same conclusion. Something important was happening in those corridor zones. To understand why, researchers had to look closely at how Texas horned lizards feed. Most people who grew up seeing these animals never knew much about their hunting behavior. Many assumed the lizards simply wandered around searching for insects. In reality, their feeding strategy is far more specialized. They rely on a method that has been refined over millions of years. An adult Texas horned lizard does not hunt randomly. Instead, it positions itself near the entrance of a harvester ant trail. There it waits patiently while ants move back and forth between the colony and feeding areas. The lizard feeds steadily and efficiently from that location. It can remain focused on the same trail for long periods of time. At first, this behavior may not seem important. After all, a single lizard eating ants does not appear capable of influencing an entire ecosystem. Researchers knew that one adult horned lizard consumes between 60 and 100 harvester ants each day. While that sounds significant, those numbers alone are not enough to directly reduce fire ant populations. The real effect comes from something much more complex. The lizard's feeding activity changes how ant colonies interact with one another. By concentrating its feeding around harvester ant trail entrances, it influences activity along the colony's outer boundaries. This creates changes in how territory is maintained and defended. Over time, those changes affect the balance between native and invasive ant species. Researchers studying the corridor zones realized that the lizards were doing more than simply finding food. Their presence was helping shape the relationship between competing ant colonies. The effect was occurring at the territory level, something no fire ant control program had specifically been designed to create. In areas where horned lizard numbers reached healthy recovery levels, harvester ant colonies maintained larger and more stable territories. Stronger territories meant native ants were better able to occupy available space. As those territories expanded, opportunities for fire ant colonies to spread became more limited. This gradual shift was being recorded in the survey data. Fire ant colony density continued to decline in the same locations where horned lizard populations were strongest. The monitoring equipment was measuring a change that nobody had originally planned to study. The numbers revealed a relationship that only became visible after years of careful observation. The discovery also helped explain a larger story. Texas horned lizards disappeared from much of the Edwards Plateau because two major problems developed at the same time. The spread of red imported fire ants reduced the harvester ant populations that the lizards depended on for food. At the same time, widespread pesticide use affected native insect communities across large areas of land. The horned lizard was never the intended target. Instead, the food web supporting it slowly fell apart. The species lost the resources it needed faster than it could adapt. As food sources disappeared, lizard populations declined across pasture after pasture. Conservation efforts eventually began to change that trend. Protection measures introduced during the 1970s helped reduce direct threats to the species. In 1977, the Texas horned lizard was officially listed as a threatened species within the state. Later, conservation groups expanded research and habitat restoration efforts. Captive breeding programs at zoos and wildlife facilities produced animals for reintroduction projects across the Edwards Plateau. At the same time, Protected corridor zones focused on restoring harvester ant populations through targeted fire ant suppression. These actions created the conditions needed for horned lizard recovery. The quiet balance returning to Texas land. The link between horned lizard recovery and changes in fire ant numbers stayed hidden for a long time. It only became visible when Dr. Sarah Kessler noticed that her transect data no longer followed the pattern built over 7 years of careful study. Something in the protected corridor zones had changed, but it did not reveal itself at first glance. To understand what was happening, Dr. Kessler returned to the 3 unusual pasture zones again and again during the next survey season. She visited them 4 separate times, carefully watching for anything new or different. On her 3rd visit to the largest corridor, she arrived at first light and stayed still for 2 hours, observing the land without interruption. From her position near a limestone outcrop, she saw something she had never recorded in earlier years. 7 Texas horned lizards appeared within the visible transect area. In the first 3 years of monitoring that same location, there had been no confirmed resident lizards at all. Now they were clearly present and active in the habitat. She carefully observed one lizard as it settled near the entrance of a harvester ant trail. It remained in that exact position for 40 minutes, feeding steadily. Its behavior was focused and calm, showing a clear pattern of long, continuous foraging at the same location. While watching, she also measured fire ant mound density within a radius of 50 meters. Then she compared those numbers to the baseline records she had collected from the same location 5 years earlier. The difference between the 2 sets of data was striking. The landscape was not behaving as it once had. Dr. Kessler sat quietly for a long time with both sets of numbers written in her field log. She did not move or speak. She simply studied the comparison, trying to understand what the land was showing her. One question began to form as she thought about what she was seeing. Could the recovery of horned lizards grow strong enough across the protected corridor network to place steady pressure on fire ant populations across the entire landscape? And could it do so before fire ants continue spreading into areas where harvester ants are still trying to recover? The lizards were already present in those 3 corridors. They were already influencing the balance between native and invasive ants in ways that chemical treatments had never achieved, even after decades of effort. The change was subtle but real, and it was happening on its own. The challenge now was scale. Dr. Kessler wondered whether this recovery could spread fast enough through the connected limestone corridors of the Edwards Plateau to make a lasting difference. Fire ants were still expanding beyond the protected zones, and the survival of harvester ants remained uncertain in many unprotected areas. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.